Not so long ago, in the 1960s, there was one particular band who desperately wanted to make it big. As time steadily moves past their heyday, one thing becomes clear. Their memory, and that of their contemporaries, is sadly fading. Picture what it must have been like for a second. The smell of coffee would dance in the air as a guitarist from the next town over cranks up his amp and twists his mic towards his mouth. The son of the town's piano teacher harmonizes into the mic, his brother providing a steady bass riff beside him. The guitarist twirls around and falls to his knees, your eyes absolutely glued to him. It's unlike anything you've seen before, and you went to high school with these guys. The club where these particular kids played is a realty office now. How the hell did that happen? That band you just heard about wasn't a metaphor. They were real people. They called themselves the Shames. I grew up in the very same town where they lived, and it's been surreal to learn about them, in every sense. They played at a pivotal moment in rock history, where sugary teenage pop was being traded out for grittier blues and soul. Sussing out how a no-label band fits into that broader story has been nothing but difficult. We're so far removed from when the Shames were performing that only newspaper clippings and scant memories survived documenting their existence. It's been 60 years. This script has been pieced together from little information, and there are parts of the band's history we will simply never know about. But that doesn't mean I can't tell their story.
I want everyone to listen. I want everyone to listen. I said listen. My world is upside down. I said listen. My world is upside down.
The story of the band begins in a small piano studio near the center of a coastal New England town called Ipswich. Dennis Trudell, a founding member of the Shames, would call this place home from the day he was born to well after his group would break apart. Born to a family of musicians, Dennis passed the time practicing piano, learning from his classically trained father. By the time he entered high school, he was incredibly skilled at his instrument. But the freedom he found in music didn't carry over to the outside world. Dennis was quite shy and never liked to outwardly rebel. Internally, things were brewing, but you'd never be able to tell just by looking at him. Following strict rules and codes was just the way things were done at a 1960s-era high school. You didn't have to look far to see others caught in the same struggle. Take, for instance, another student at Ipswich High, Joey Emerald. Joey, a neighbor of Dennis and 2 grades younger, had a lot in common with the pianist. For one, both were aspiring musicians and both loved rock and roll. As a child, Joey would frequently go to informal dances called record hops, which featured rock music in abundance. Joey quickly became obsessed, aspiring to become a drummer. Unlike Dennis, however, Joey didn't have the luxury of having musical equipment already set up in his home. He had to wait, agonizingly so, for his first set of drums to be delivered to Ipswich High, killing time by practicing in whatever way he could. He would take 2 drumsticks and drill every Beatles song he could think of by tapping away at a book. After 6 long months of waiting, the day finally came, but Joey found himself in a uniquely unlucky time and place.
I got my first set of drums the day President Kennedy was assassinated. They were delivered to the high school, and I ran into the music room and I set them up, and the principal and the music director came in and said, "You can't play those drums, the president's been shot." So I packed them up and I brought them home to my house. I set them up in my bedroom, and my parents came in and said, "You can't play those drums, the president's been shot." So I covered them with a blanket. Played them anyway. The whole world was in mourning over Kennedy, and I understand that, but I just got my first set of drums.
Joey's story was by no means unique. Everything, including music, ground to a complete and total halt after Kennedy's death. Understandably, as a teen, Joey found this kind of absurd, still practicing whenever he could as the winter rolled on. Waiting for the mood to thaw seemed unbearable at points, but Joey would soon be in very good luck. An invasion was gearing up to sweep not only his hometown, but redefine music as we know it.
Now tonight, you're going to twice be entertained by them. Right now, and again in the second half of our show. Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!
I don't exactly need to explain to you why the Beatles are important. The thing that many don't remember about the group is how unremarkable they seemed before their breakthrough. They started off as schoolboys, inspired by British musicians they saw playing covers of Black American music on TV. Because millions of kids were receiving the same programming, the boys from Liverpool weren't exactly unique in their ambitions. According to University of Illinois professor Ron Cohen, it's estimated there were 30 to 50,000 amateur rock groups running around Britain, all with roughly the same intentions as the boys from Liverpool. What made the Beatles unique was their incredible knack for co-opting what had come before. Combine Leadbelly, Howlin' Wolf, Little Richard, and the Shirelles, and you'll get something pretty close to the Fab Four. When the Beatles graced American TV sets, they were essentially kicking off the cycle of imitation all over again. Now, being an amateur musician in America was the coolest thing in the world. Dennis and Joey found that this newfound excitement around music started to lift people's spirits for the first time since the assassination, and they couldn't be more happy. Dennis and Joey unintentionally separated themselves from most of the bands forming at the time. Most of their contemporaries had barely even seen a guitar in person, let alone known how to play one. Dennis and Joey were both trained in music. Dennis from his family, and Joey, initially self-trained, was now playing in the school band and orchestra. Still, the two were eager to dive into what everybody else was doing. And so, in June of 1964, the inevitable happened. Dennis and Joey, formerly just neighbors, were now bandmates. Joey leapt at the opportunity to play drums, and Dennis, shy of the mic, would sit behind the keyboard. The rest of the lineup primarily fell into place due to ease of access, all members coming from Ipswich High. Most notable would be Dennis's younger brother, Gerard. Another trained musician alongside his brother, Gerard filled in on bass guitar. Surprisingly, he didn't fit the archetype of high school musician that one might have in their head. Gerard was an athlete, literally posing front and center in photos for the football team. The band defied the stereotypical image many have of a teenage band, simply because everybody was in a teenage band at the time. The identity of the scene and the identity of the Shames was in constant flux. The band didn't even call themselves the Shames at that point. Dennis, Joey, and Gerard originally formed under the name The Dimensions, and they would keep it for their first 2 years in action. For a solid month, The Dimensions were without a vocalist. Eventually, though, they convinced high school classmate Joyce Janulis to be their singer. Joyce was shy, but she had a powerful range, and would serve as The Dimensions' frontwoman. Rounding out the lineup with 2 additional guitarists, The Dimensions had a full troupe. The only thing left was to buckle down and practice.
We practiced at Dennis's house because, the basement was all set up with a band. We'd start off with a piano and then we'd add parts. If we get that song, you better go home and practice it. That was the deal. Don't come back to rehearsal not ready to play.
Even though the Dimensions were a skilled group, they were still in their infancy as a band. Dennis and Joyce, the 2 members at the helm of the Dimensions, were both naturally shy and introverted. This held the group back at an especially competitive time. With no exaggeration, you could find multiple high school-aged bands in almost every town across the US, all playing the same variety of music: garage rock. The genre could easily become formulaic and simplistic if members of a given band weren't pushing the boundaries of their sound. Often, to gain appeal, a garage rock band would have to compensate for the sea of musicians just like them with massive showmanship. The sound of the genre quickly evolved into a raucous combination of amps cranked to the point of distortion, manic vocalists, and pounding backbeats. The Dimensions, while talented, bore little resemblance to these standout bands. They exclusively played covers, mostly pop music at the time, making them even more indistinguishable from their peers. The band wasn't discouraged in any way, but they were far from realizing their musical potential. Thankfully, the group was lucky enough to have the generosity of a man who truly wanted them to succeed. Shortly after formation, they brought in Chuck Larrivee, who would quickly become the band's manager. Chuck was Joey's half-brother, 10 years his senior, and served as a support structure for the planning, coordination, and marketing of the band.
Chuck did a lot. My brother did a lot. He would book the band. He was on the phone constantly. And he would go to all the meetings. He'd do all that stuff. We didn't do any of that. We just go rehearse and go play.
Chuck performed the menial duties of having a band, oftentimes acting as a parental figure, driving the Dimensions to and from gigs, and chaperoning the group. This was an incredibly common arrangement at the time. The Dimensions even had a second chaperone, Chuck's wife, Nancy. It's easy to walk away with the impression that Chuck and Nancy must have been incredibly overbearing, but that's just not the case. The Dimensions loved them both. The couple might as well have been honorary members. Nancy would attend nearly every concert the band would go on to perform, and was an equally fervent cheerleader of the group alongside her husband. Thanks to Chuck and Nancy, the Dimensions had more time to practice and find their footing musically, and Chuck would serve as cheerleader and coach. The Dimensions started making regular appearances at a coffee house in Ipswich called King's Rook, thanks to Chuck's generosity. It was a venue that the band deeply enjoyed, with people coming in every week to see them. These types of grassroots local performances were common. The Dimensions played high school dances, parades, and even weddings all around Essex County. However, one particular type of concert overshadowed all previously mentioned. If you were worth anything in garage rock, you played Battle of the Bands. These events were jam-packed and ridiculously popular among high schoolers. Battle of the Bands was the event for young rock musicians. This was both a blessing and a curse. Entry was easy, and even promised lucrative cash prizes, but rising to the top with the sheer amount of competitors was no easy feat. There were more than a dozen bands on the North Shore of Massachusetts alone, and the Dimensions were being outperformed.
In the first performance, I remember they wore an outfit that looked very 50-ish. If I remember correctly, I think there was a cummerbund with a long sash, and they were made fun of because it was so 50-ish. And that's when they started to change.
As the Dimensions continued to feverishly practice and play, things started to finally take shape. The Dimensions earned second place in their division at a local Battle of the Bands, attended by more than 900 people. Even more exciting, the group was touring out of state. Chuck kept a giant Volkswagen bus in his backyard that all the members of the band would pile into, getting them to and from whatever show they were playing. It was getting to the point where they were making money off of this. Still, throughout the band's lifespan, it would never be enough to make a living.
They were all living with their parents. I don't think any of them had jobs. I have no recollection of the amount of money. It certainly wasn't anything that they could make a living on.
Despite that, one of the most remarkable aspects of the band is how lucky they were in terms of connections. Chuck and Nancy were incredibly generous, doing everything in their power to make the band succeed, including making friends in high places. Ipswich, being relatively comfortable, had no shortage of people willing to sponsor artists. One was a member of the immensely wealthy Crane family, using a company he owned to serve as the group's booking agent. The Dimensions, while having access to many opportunities of financial support, never let that go to their heads, always keeping their wits about them. This would be necessary shortly, as they were about to encounter the wilder aspects of their scene on the college circuit. You can almost see drunken college kids running amok, lampshades on heads, stumbling, girls dancing wildly, beer spilling onto couches and carpets. All modes of decorum take a backseat whenever a song blares from the speakers. The Dimensions, in comparison, were downright straight-laced, rarely ever engaging with rowdy members of the crowd. They were coming into their own, not as a destructive posse like so many around them, but people who simply didn't fit the status quo, existing in a gray area between rebellion and obedience.
We really didn't have an attitude. This is how we identified. If somebody picked up a record contract for us, we wouldn't have changed. Like it or not, that was us.
The exact definition of us was starting to evolve. Up until this point, they looked like they could have played at the record hops of Joey's youth. Now, they were growing out their hair and wearing polka dots. They weren't trying to get a rise out of anybody, but it happened just the same. At one point, the group was heckled by an adult woman who barked, "What a crying shame," complaining of their long, hippie-like hair. The incident became a huge joke amongst the band's members. So much so, after they found out the name Dimensions was being used, they decided the band was due for a name change. At first the Crying Shames, and then just the Shames. Just as they were starting to solidify their identity, things began to shake up all over again. Half of the group's membership quit. Joyce stopped singing, likely due to the ever-increasing intensity of performing on stage. The group's 2 additional guitarists also walked away, one of them almost certainly being drafted into Vietnam. This part of the timeline is murky. Exact details are hard to come by over half a century. We don't know exactly when each performer left, or even when exactly the name change occurred, but the end result was the same. The Shames were on the cusp of really taking things to the next level, but like almost every amateur garage rock group, they were struggling to last beyond high school. However, the lineup changes turned out to be a major blessing in disguise. They left a spot open for one of the most influential members of the Shames to join their group, a young guitarist named J.B. Amaro. Up until that point, the band, despite all their energy, was still primarily playing covers. In a world of endless garage rock combos, playing the same standards again and again just wasn't going to cut it. JB was everything they needed. Already gifted at writing original material and obsessed with music from the day he was born. He was raised in a rural fishing town bordering Ipswich, and got to start playing guitar after trading a trumpet for a beat-up amplifier.
Growing up in a small town like Essex, Mass, it was pretty isolated. I just lived on the river and had a good time. My favorite music in them days was all the old black acts, James Brown, especially James Brown. I didn't care much for the rock and roll. Some of the stuff was too simple.
He might have come from the middle of nowhere, but his ambition was something to be reckoned with. He wouldn't have anything to do with people who didn't take music seriously, and would sleep with a guitar in his hand, practicing day in and day out. He idolized the soul and R&B groups he would see in Boston clubs. The raw emotion, the stage presence, the musical excellence. It was everything to him. It was his destiny. JB was already a member of a highly ranked local band called the Barons, writing a good chunk of original material while playing with them. His group ranked at the top of every battle of the bands they participated in. Chuck Larrabee, recognizing his potential, approached JB and asked him to join the band.
I couldn't believe it because I used to laugh at that group, but they evolved and they made me an offer, and they were looking at a guy that could play guitar. And I never really thought I played that good, but I guess I was as good as it gets for Essex, Mass. Population 3.
JB is underselling himself. The guitar was practically glued to his chest at all times, and while he couldn't read any music, he could play, and he could play well. Not only that, he was an excellent vocalist, bringing raw emotion and intensity to every piece he sang on. JB wasn't just good, he was superb, in every sense a musician can be. He would almost single-handedly kick the band into the phase that took them from a relatively forgettable act to a group that was arguably the best garage rock outfit in all of New England.
Well, I'm like a broken limb on a tree. Since you left me, I lost a part of me. Try to forget you, I won't be taken again. I know I was used now, like a bull in the bin.
Dennis was now singing alongside the guitarist, and they brought in a new member, Patty Germoni, to fill in on keys. With the band's final lineup assembled, they shifted their attention and started writing their own songs.
Well, the Crying Shames was more of an original. Dennis played piano very well. He wrote a lot of the songs. But when he got together with JB, then they put their stuff together, lyrics, music, and that's how we created our own music.
Dennis had experimented with making his own songs under the Dimensions, But in that era of the band, songwriting was never a priority. JB thought differently. Good music can't be repetitive, and it especially can't be boring. The Shames weren't boring, but they had a habit of playing only hits. The crowd loved it, but JB wanted to go further.
If you don't take requests, you're not a popular band. But we played. We would play, and we'd try to do solos, and we'd try to do all kinds of stuff to make the band sound like the Shames, you know. Even if we took regular written music, we would try to play it our way.
I don't think they particularly compared themselves to anybody else. It was their own thing. They weren't at all interested in playing, for instance, the Beatles music.
The Shames defined themselves in terms of their influences, which when put together became something very raw and energetic. Their sound wasn't close to mainstream sugary pop or burgeoning psychedelia, music JB would dismiss as milkhouse. The Shames sounded much closer to something like a grittier version of the Kinks or the Rolling Stones. Something that could easily be construed as an early version of punk rock. This was an odd outcome. JB thought of himself as a soul musician, if anything. The rest of the band's influences, whatever they may have been, all outputted to something that was very much of the Shames.
When we left the Dimension scene and we went into our own thing, was that we needed something that would identify us, you know. People enjoyed us because we were ourselves.
My world is upside down. My world is upside down. Yeah.
The Shames would bounce around various colleges as the summer of 1966 rolled around, but they would also play a number of gigs around Ipswich. They continued to play at King's Rook, which was becoming quite popular, being recognized almost everywhere the band toured. It was a welcome boost, considering by now they were the house band of the club. They were also featured in a short-lived venue down the road from the Rook, advertising exclusively to college kids. Thought up by the band's benefactor from the Crane family and his business partner, what would become the Garage at Go-Go was envisioned as a multi-story, glitzy performance hall with bars serving soft drinks, roaring 20s decor, and even bowls of peanuts on every table. The Go-Go, almost certainly funded in part from the Crane estate's extensive wealth, could have been the start of something career-changing. However, the most mundane of problems would have it dead on arrival. Ipswich just didn't have much parking around the area.
The whole town was blocked. Everybody that knew her, hundreds of people that came to that opening, police trying to break up the traffic jam. It was incredible.
The Shames played the Go-Go for the blink it was open, getting the opportunity to play sets in between groups like the Shirelles, who had massively influenced the zeitgeist of the 60s. This brush with a group who the Beatles practically owed their career to wouldn't last. Within a week, the permits for the building were rescinded, and the band went back to performing their sets at the Rook. The lifespan of the Go-Go, while brief and not affecting the band logistically, was far from forgettable. It served as a reminder of what could have been if things had gone even slightly differently. In spite of the Go-Go's failure, there was still cause to celebrate. Joey had been accepted into Berkeley to study drumming in the fall, and touring was really starting to take off. They upgraded from their old Volkswagen, ripping out all the seats in the school bus and replacing them with bunks, creating a makeshift RV for the group.
I never had classes on Fridays because we would meet Thursday night, pack up, and go to these colleges. We played all of this circuit. University of Massachusetts, University of New Hampshire, University of Maine, Vermont. We did a lot of playing in Vermont.
Berkeley provided a huge boost in Joey's playing, but he and the band still existed in their own sphere, musically and personally. The band's emphasis on individuality was something that would lead to fantastical outcomes.
And I was going to Berkeley, and I got called in the assistant dean's office, and he said to me, if you come to school on Monday and you haven't cut your hair, you're not going to be in school here anymore. So I went home that weekend, and my sister happened to be home. So I cut my hair, but I had her dye it white. You know, she took all the color out of my hair. So when I went back to school on Monday, the assistant dean said, "You're a rebel." I said, "Well, you told me to cut my hair." I did.
Long hair, as trivial as it might sound today, was a massive deal back in the mid-60s. It was a rejection of the rigid conformity expected throughout childhood. However, Joey outright rejected the title of rebellion, saying growing out your hair was simply the thing to do at the time.
We were just trying to be a band that people liked and go hear us play.
Nancy had a far less black and white take.
Certainly, in comparison to today, very, very modestly. They didn't get into any trouble. I don't even know I particularly heard the word marijuana till about that time. And still, it was not something that most kids I knew were involved in.
Nobody in the Shames heavily engaged in drug use, despite the cultural ubiquity of drugs at the time. JB outwardly claimed he couldn't even be around pot. The Shames almost certainly avoided drugs, in part because it got in the way of their songwriting. It was just as well, because throughout their career, they hadn't even gotten anything down onto vinyl. After more than a year of waiting for a tentative recording date, the band finally headed down to Hyannis at the tail end of 1966. The plan was to get a single out, hopefully get a record deal, and ultimately make a career as musicians. The Shames had come so far from exclusively playing high school dances, and now they were looking at the gateway to becoming full-time professional musicians. Little did they know, the 5 minutes and 11 seconds produced from this session would comprise the entire recorded history of the band's music. Chris Bishop, a garage rock historian who wrote an article dedicated to the band, described the single like this. The Shames crank out both songs on this single like it's the only shot they'd ever get. There's no weak playing here, just guitars overloading the studio's inputs, a drummer slamming out the beat, and a vocalist cutting loose. Overall reception of the session was mixed amongst the group. Joey thought the end result was great, complimenting the acoustics of the makeshift studio. JB was disappointed with the end product, thinking it made the band look far more amateurish than they actually were. In time, though, the record has been widely cited as a garage rock classic, perfectly encapsulating a moment in history. It wasn't the greatest record of the era, and the band's scope was limited to only the northeastern US, but their potential was clear. Immediately after release, the band was interviewed on several radio stations across New Hampshire. The Shames, who steadily ascended up the amateur circuit, now found themselves starting from the bottom amongst professional groups after they put out their single. They even played alongside an early form of the Jay Giles Band. Their rigorous touring schedule continued, getting as far as Buffalo, New York. Still, it was a hodgepodge of gigs for the band. They played on mountaintops, along the Canadian border, pubs in Boston, cow barns in New Hampshire. In Vermont, they even met Bo Diddley while touring, a blues legend who inspired everyone from Buddy Holly to The Clash. The Shames, sadly, wouldn't stay together long enough to see their work reach cult status. After another year of touring, things seemed to slowly come to a halt. One newspaper article released a few years after the band's demise attributed the breakup to Gerard Trudell being drafted into Vietnam. The bassist did serve in the war, but the members of the Shames interviewed for this project either had no recollection of him being drafted or didn't bring it up in the first place. The exact circumstances of how the band broke up remain unclear.
We all kind of had something else to do.
We all outgrew each other. They went in our separate ways, I guess.
Things were kind of winding down. And to be honest with you, I don't even remember why it wound down. It just did.
The last documented gig the Shames had was on New Year's Eve of 1967, 3.5 years after they first formed. By 1968, the band was done. An anticlimactic end to a group that had so much potential. What little they committed to tape slowly faded away, though not without being praised. The Shames were reissued by an independent record label owner called Tim Warren, a self-described garage rock fanatic regularly embarking on road trips to hunt down singles, Warren would describe the band as the creators of, quote, by far the best garage record of the entire New England area. The glory days of the group became a collection of fond, distant memories for its former members. JB became a professional musician, touring across the country, and claimed to have rubbed shoulders with people like Eddie Levert, Merle Haggard, and Willie Nelson. Joey also played professionally for a time, drumming on a Caribbean cruise line, and eventually moving across the continent to teach lessons on the kit. Dennis had a more modest relationship with music later in life, making home recordings with a friend well into his late 60s, no doubt reminiscing about his old band. The Shames didn't survive the Johnson administration. They only released 2 songs. They rarely ever had gigs outside of New England. But they were people whose work was considered excellent in a genre consumed by endless mediocrity. Everybody wants to know what Eric Clapton or David Gilmour's ins and outs are, but we often forget that the people who were at the bottom of the ladder, comparatively, are just as interesting. I guess the story of the Shames matters because, while they are unremarkable in the face of supposed rock gods, they made something really cool in spite of that. Something that resonates. Something that you can lose yourself in, even if it's just for a few minutes, separated by scratchy vinyl. In spite of every setback, the Shames still cut through, and you can tell they cared.